It was fun to get to start some of our small groups this last week. I enjoy being a part of the Journey Together small group, a ladies small group that meets here on Wednesdays. And for our icebreaker, get to know you activity, Jamie led a Would You Rather game. And she did an awesome job. And there were fun would you rathers, like coffee or tea, the beach or the mountains. It was great. And also made me think of past would you rather games that I've played with my children that went very differently than Jamie's would you rather went on Wednesday. Usually they were very either gross or impossible to choose between. There are things like, if you could only eat one food for the rest of your life, and it had to be either snails or spiders, which one would you choose? Or it would be something like, if you had to be stuck for the rest of your life by yourself on a deserted island in the middle of the ocean or in a jungle with no one around, which one would you choose? Another one that I remember one time is like, if your only way to move for the rest of your life was to hop backwards or crawl on your belly, which would you choose? And see, the thing about the Would You Rather game is that the whole point is that you have to pick one. Like, you don't get to decide what the choices are, even when most of the time I just wanted to say no thank you to all of the above. Sometimes we encounter challenges and struggles in life that we would rather not go through. We'd rather have different options. But life doesn't always give us different options. Today we're going to be reading through Acts 27, and it's the narrative of Paul going through a literal storm and shipwreck. And I'd like to, as we go through the story and understand the story, to then ask, how might this story help us navigate our own storms and shipwrecks? And those are more figurative, but the storms of life that we each go through. At this point, at the book of Acts, we only have a couple more chapters left, and Paul has been in Caesarea for several years under house arrest and is now being sent to Caesar in Rome. And so we're going to read through the whole text during our time together. So if you want to pull it up, there's Bibles under the seats. You can follow up here. You can also pull it up on your phone. Either way, but we will be reading through in different chunks through the entire chapter of 27 today. There are a lot of names. So good thing this is a place of grace and no judgment as we read through it. When it was decided that we should sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from Adramyttium, about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. The next day, we sailed to Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so they might provide for his needs. From there, we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Sicilia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salomne. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Haven near the town of Lasea. Much time had been lost and the sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. So Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives also." But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete, facing both southwest and northwest. So as you can see, this is one of the final legs of Paul's trip to Rome. And we have a map here. They started off in Caesarea, and they're going to go along all the way up to Rome in Italy eventually. But the conditions of this trip were very difficult. Typically, most of the voyage, the sea voyage, and the ships would travel on the Mediterranean Sea. Most of that happened between the months of May and October. In fact, Egypt was a part, or at least the northernmost part of Egypt, was a part of the Roman Empire at this time. And much of the food, the grain that fed the Roman Empire came from northern Africa. Egypt at that time was called the breadbasket of Rome. But much of the travel with the grain and the cargo that came from North Africa, they traveled the Mediterranean Sea between May and October. And towards the end of that season, it was a bit of a gamble. The conditions were rough. And so we know likely after the Day of Atonement, around this time, it would have been the end of September, beginning of October, and strong winds could pick up, and it could be a very dangerous time. And so they chose to travel, but they were hoping to winter in a specific harbor in Phoenix because it was more protected from the winds that would kick up during that time. And Paul stands up and he tells the people that he's with, he warns them, this is not going to go well. I know what's going to happen. He predicts a loss of both the cargo and the ship. And he says this could be even deadly for us. And yet the majority chose to sail on. And so our story continues in verse 13. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity, and so they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force, called the northeaster, swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, and so we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of by the way, it keeps saying that, to the lee of the island means it's the side of the island that the wind's not hitting. It's the side of the island that's more sheltered. I had to look that word up. I was like, I have no idea what that is. That's what that means. So as we passed to the lee of the small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. And so the men hoisted it aboard. Then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis. They lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed." Last night, an angel of God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island." And so the storm gets dangerous, right? The conditions worsen. The wind kicks up, hurricane force winds. And remember, this is the first century here. This is likely around 60 AD. And so you can imagine the the technology of the ships at that time and being out on sea on a big ship like that. So they take the ropes and they try to tie the ropes on the underside of the ship just to give it more support, just to hold it together. They lower the anchor to try to slow the ship down as the winds move the ship at high speeds. They throw out some of the cargo, some of the things, likely grain and other things that they were selling, just to lighten the load and stabilize the ship to help it prevent it from sinking. They even throw off the edge part of the tackle, like the equipment and gear that they would need to sail smoothly on such a ship. After days, they gave up hope of being saved. After days, through their experience, they realized there's just no way out of this. There's no way to be rescued from this. And that's when Paul gets up again and speaks up again. And I can't help but chuckle because he starts with, "And I told you so." Paul's also very human. So he has to start with, "And I told you so. You could have spared yourself all this loss and damage had you just listened to me. But now," and then he gets to the good part. He says, "Take courage. We will lose the ship, but we will live," is essentially his message. He says, "An angel from God last night came and visited me and told me not to be afraid." And the angel had a message specifically for Paul, that Paul would indeed stand before Caesar for his trial and preach the gospel before Caesar. And also the angel said that God would graciously save everyone on the ship. And it was quite a large ship. 276, I think, is what the number that it's going to give us in just a second. So after days of struggle and no hope of salvation, after everyone's morale is super low, Paul says, it's going to get worse. We're going to wreck, but God's going to save our lives. Let's continue. We're about halfway through the chapter. On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea when about midnight the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that they would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved." And so the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. Just before dawn, Paul urged them to eat. "For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head." After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of all of them. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. As the situation gets more and more dire and hopeless for the sailors tried to escape. Those on board who knew how to run the ship, right, knew what to do, they tried to lower the lifeboats to save themselves, and it would have been at the expense of everyone else. And so Paul warns the Roman soldiers that they really need the sailors' expertise in order to survive. And I find this just a fascinating little twist in the story, because not only does it reveal much about human nature and sometimes how humans respond in crisis and in a survival situation, but it's also fascinating to me to think that God could have saved their lives without the sailors. This is the God of the universe that we're talking about here. But God chose to work through sailors who had both lost hope and were so scared that they were running away. that God wants to work with people and through people to accomplish God's purposes. And I think that's a really beautiful part of this story. Even when they had given up, God had not given up hope for them. Paul then stands and again gathers people and addresses a basic need. We need to eat. We haven't been eating. You need food to survive. You need that strength to survive. He reiterates the message from God that they will be saved. Their life will be saved. And then he takes the bread and he breaks it and he gives thanks. In the middle of the storm, if you can just pause for a minute and imagine what the setting was like, the volume, the motion, the movement of the ship, the shouting, the water. In the middle of the storm, Paul chooses to gather people and mimic Jesus' actions, giving thanks, breaking bread, even as the shipwreck they knew was unavoidable. The dire situation they found themselves in did not negate the reasons they had to be thankful to God. And it's so easy to get tunnel vision, isn't it? And we're going through something really, really hard. It's easy to only see that. And in the middle of the storm, Paul expands his vision. And he still gives thanks to God. For God was still with them. God was still speaking. And God was still working to save. And as the people ate and listened and gave thanks, they were encouraged with a renewed hope. And they tossed more of the grain over the side. They were willing to get rid of more of the profit, right? Just to survive. Our last section of chapter 27. When the daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. So cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow struck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered that those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces of ship. And in this way, everyone reached land safely. You imagine the moment that the ship struck the sandbar, struck so hard that the front of the ship got stuck in the sand. And then the waves and the battering of the sea that was raging around them was so destructive that it was breaking apart the back of the ship. And there was these pieces of planks and ship and cargo floating around, all around them on the sea. The ship was no longer seaworthy at that time. And so the soldiers' response was what was actually expected of them at that time. A Roman soldier's job was to deliver the prisoners to the intended destination. And if they weren't able to do that, they were to kill the prisoners so that they wouldn't escape, or they themselves would be killed. And so there was really non-negotiable for them. You bring the prisoners in, you kill, or you kill them or be killed. And yet Julius the centurion, who's been working with Paul, who's in charge of Paul at this time, prevented this from happening at great risk to himself and the soldiers he was leading. Imagine the chaos and the destruction. The wind blowing, the ship being battered, the debris from the ship all around them. And then all of a sudden, the Roman soldiers get out the swords and they're ready to kill the prisoners. And then the yelling and the commands, no, we're not going to do that. Here's what we're going to do. And the pivot. And eventually, in the midst of all the chaos, everyone makes it to land. And not a single person in the 276 people on the ship is lost that day. That's where we're going to pause in the story of Acts today. But what a dramatic last chapter of Paul's journeys. We find out from the letters that Paul has been shipwrecked more than 3 times. Like, he's got experience with this. Like, it's been a crazy journey. When I step back and I look at this, there are a few things that really jump out to me. First, it's that Paul listens to God's voice in the middle of a deadly storm. Paul listens to God's voice as the ship is being wrecked. And I wonder in my life, I want to ask you to reflect in your life, are we able to do the same? Is that our norm? Is that our tendency? For me, sometimes I get so fixated on the God, I want different choices in this would you rather of life. Like, I would rather not do this, whatever this is in front of me. Or I get so fixated on asking the question, why? Why, God? Why is this happening? That I never get to the point where I'm asking, where are you, God, in this storm? What are you doing in the here and now? God, how might you work through these circumstances for your glory and for our good? I love how Paul listens to God's voice in the middle of the storm. He intentionally draws his awareness to God and chooses to acknowledge who God is, knowing that God is with them. And then we see God's response. We see how God is working. Hindsight, right? As we read the story, we see how God did save them. We see how God did protect them, how he provided hope when there was no hope, and rescue from the storm. I can't help but think of Jesus' words in John 16 when he says, in this world you will have trouble. Like, you're gonna have trouble. But take heart, I have overcome the world. Sometimes I wish we could avoid all the trouble. I wish there were no storms in life. But the reality of being human in a broken world is that there are storms. There will be these figurative shipwrecks. And as we navigate those, God is with us. And we're invited to turn our awareness to God. So what storms are we navigating today? What storms are you navigating in your life, in your circles? Does it feel like a storm? Does it feel like a shipwreck right now? I want to use this story in kind of a different way today. Invite us to think of the description of Paul's journey here through the storm and the shipwreck as an allegory or as a metaphor for our struggles in life. And I want to ask us, where would you place yourself in this narrative? What does your life feel like as you're navigating hard things? Would you be one of the ones throwing the cargo overboard off the side of the ship? Would you be one of the ones who've lost hope? Would you be trying to save yourself at the expense of others? Would you be using your influence to save those condemned by those in power? Maybe right now in the storms that you're navigating, you feel like you'd be the one swimming for dear life as the waves go up and down, as you dodge the debris floating all around? Or do you feel like maybe you'd be one of the ones hanging on to a piece of the ship, just waiting to be washed ashore? What part of this story resonates most with the struggles in your life right now? You know, as a community, there are a lot of different storms and shipwrecks that we have to navigate in a lot of different areas of our life. And so what I would like us to do, as we acknowledge that heavy reality, is that I want to invite us as a community to pause and gather around a communion meal. Like Paul paused in the middle of the storm to imitate Jesus, to follow Jesus' examples, we too pause and we expand our perspective and we gather around communion. Communion is also called the Lord's Supper. It's also called the Eucharist, and something that Jesus invited us to, all his followers to. It represents his body on the cross and the blood that was shed for us, his atoning sacrifice that conquered evil and brought hope, that showed us how to navigate, how to go through this life. And so I want to invite our communion servers up. And after I say a prayer, I'm going to invite anyone who'd like to share in communion to come up the center aisles and receive communion and then go down the side aisles. I invite you to take a big deep breath. It's easy to bring to mind the storms and the challenges of our lives. And so I ask you just to do that for a minute. Ooh, there's some big things, right? You're navigating. And then as you pause and as you breathe, I invite you to turn your awareness to God. A God who is love, a God who is present. And I invite you to, in your heart and in your mind quietly, ask God to join you in that storm. I think we'll find that as we draw our awareness to God, we'll realize that God is already there with us in the storm. And so today we break bread together and we too give thanks. We give thanks to the Creator God who became human to show humanity how to love. We give thanks for Jesus' human body given as the perfect sacrifice on the cross to conquer evil. We give thanks for Jesus' blood poured out for the forgiveness of sins. Today we give thanks for a God who is with us, creating and sustaining life and making everything new. We give thanks for the divine spirit of love that dwells within us to transform, to guide, and to comfort us. We give thanks for the strength and hope found in God in the middle of life's storms. Thank you, Jesus. Amen. Leave here with this benediction. As we navigate life, full of all the sunny days and all the storms, may God's presence and nearness sustain us.